to AZ104, Microsoft Azure Administrator course, day 2. Today, we're going to learn about virtual networking. We're also going to learn about how the inter-site connectivity works, and also learn about the network traffic management, including Azure Load Balancer. So without further ado, let's get started. So in the virtual networking element, we're going to talk about virtual network for sure, but then how we're going to secure those virtual network so we can use network security groups. And also, if we need to point a domain name rather than IP addresses and a custom domain, also, excuse me, setting up like our virtual network to point to a name which can be easily remember, and all the records which we need to have to point a domain like NS record, CNAME, A record, TXT records, and so on. So we're going to talk about Azure DNS as well. So in virtual network, we have number of things which you need to create to set up a virtual network. And before we create, as other sessions I have told you, that everything you create, make sure you plan it properly. So when you're planning it, you get the outcome of one, what you need to create, how you need to create it, what is it going to cost, and how fundamentally or technically it's going to work. So you have a clear picture rather than spinning up so many other resources which are going to cost you a lot. Instead, you make sure you plan it properly and then implement it. You always have a room to modify it if that doesn't solve the 100% of your purpose. So to set up virtual network, you need to create one. Then you also need to create a subnet, subnetting what we call. Plan IP addressing, whether it's going to work on a public IP or private IP. And if we create those IP addresses, how are we going to associate or assign those IP addresses? In the demonstration, we will see all these type of resources we create, and you will learn how it's actually going to look like, in terms of the creation wise. But I also strongly recommend you try that, practice it yourself as well. Okay. So when planning a virtual network, example, we're taking a resource as a virtual machine is one of our resource. Excuse me. So virtual network has NIC, network interface card. That's where the IP address is getting assigned. The IP address is associates with subnet, and that actually become a part of virtual network. But when we set up a virtual network, it's actually technically it's a fundamental block of your networking or private network. So a virtual network enables many type of Azure resources, such as VM, which we just took the example, to communicate securely with each other, and also to communicate with internet, and also to communicate with on-premise network if needed. So a virtual network is similar to a traditional networking we do and operate within our own data center. A similar thing is available in cloud, which is Azure Virtual Network, VNet, we call it. But in Azure, it brings additional benefit like such as scaling, availability, isolation, and so on. So in overall, virtual network gives you number of benefits, not only those connectivity which we discussed about, like inter-resource connectivity, internet connectivity, on-prem network connectivity. Apart from that, it also gives you filtering network traffic and routing networking traffic features as well. And wherever you do the resource integration between two resources when they start talking, the VNet is actually heavily plays the part of it. Okay. So in the next slide, it's all we're going to talk about creating virtual network. So in Azure, when you start creating virtual network, it's going to ask you about set a subscription, set the right resource group, give a name to your virtual network, and also give a region, which region you want to create this virtual network. It's very important you select the right region for it. So this is the reason we say, like, always plan to use an address space that is not already in use in the organization, and also plan the security elements you needed, whether it's going to be needed for the VPN connectivity or so on. So those are the planning. If you do, when you're setting this up, you will literally go step by step element, which is like, as you see, we have the basic setup. That's the one element, but then you will require the IP addresses to be set up, security to be set up. If you operate in your organization for compliance perspective, you put on the billing perspective, you put correct tags, you review, validate, and create it. Okay. So these are the elements you needed. So if you plan it properly, then when you're creating those resources, you don't get stuck. Subnets and subnetting. This is one of the important part of IP address assignment. So a virtual network can be segmented into one or more subnets. So here are some of the examples have been given about the subnetting. Subnet provides a logical division within your network and also improves the security, increases performance, and make it easier to manage the network. Now, each subnet must have a unique address range and cannot overlap with other subnet. That's very, very important. So even in this example, you can see, like, IP address is starting with 10. It's got 0, then 1, 2, here is 30, and 3. So you can literally see this, like, the IP address range and the subnetting is different. Now, there is one element which I like to demonstrate, and I collected here. So I would strongly recommend, not this one. Let me get that screen here. So I collected that one screen, which I like to show you in terms of the subnet table. I'm pretty sure you must have seen it already, but it's good to have that recall done. So if you search for IPv4 CIDR blocks, yeah, CIDR, you can easily find this kind of tables everywhere. So if you do your subnetting, say IP address range /24, then you will be looking at 256 addresses. But within 256 addresses, there are some addresses are reserved. So you need to be mindful of that. So how Azure operates. Yeah. So just have a look at it. This kind of, like, what is the address format? What's the sign-up blocks look like? Just to get yourself familiarized. So when you set up these network blocks, subnetting blocks, you will know, like, what to expect, how many number of IP addresses to expect. And this is all ultimately works on the planning phase. So you need to be mindful of, like, what you actually use in the planning phase. And that's how you can easily operate there. Okay, great. So let's go back to our slides. So the other element comes with subnet. You need to think about your IP addresses. And as a best practice, you may decide to separate dynamic or statically assigned IP addresses into different subnets. And IP addresses are never managed from within a virtual machine. So you can actually assign that through the subnetting and the VNet. So here you typically needs to think, where will I need the private IP address and where will I need the public IP addresses? So if I have any resources, example, websites or web applications or any kind of application which I need to expose over internet, or is it going to be public facing services? I must have a public IP address. It's not going to work on a private. So this is a mandatory requirement here for these kind of purposes. But that Azure resource might connect to another Azure resource within the network within the Azure through either multiple VNets and VNet peering, or on-premise network to using on-premise gateway or VPN gateways, S2S connectivity, or express route. All these kind of use cases where you must have a private IP address, because probably anything you are connecting behind the Azure resource, you don't want to expose that internet or on internet or public facing services. One, it actually reduces in terms of any hackers attack or any term of any element of exposing to public network, which makes it easy for vulnerable attacks. So to avoid that and protect that, this is a scenario which works better. So it's always the best thing to allow, put as a best practice. So in a private IP address used within Azure VNets and on-premise, as we discussed here, VPN gateway, express route. In a VPN gateway, S2S. So that's something you need to be mindful of. Okay. And also in this one, which again, let me take you back to this address list, what I've actually just put it back into a Word document just for easy understanding. So when you're subnetting and assigning those IP addresses, or range through, say, let's assume this is a private IP addresses, and subnetting we have set up, and we set up like /24 256 addresses we're going to get. So out of 256 addresses, we cannot use 1.0 because that value identifies the virtual network address. We cannot use 1.1 because Azure configures this address as the default gateway. We also cannot use 1.2 and 1.3 because that Azure maps these Azure DNS IP addresses to the virtual network space. And also we cannot use the last one, which is 255. So this value supplies the virtual network broadcast address. Between these, we can use any of those. So 1.4 to 254, we can use this. Or it can be utilized, automatically assigned or dynamically assigned. Other things to consider when it comes to the IP addresses. So IP addresses can be statically assigned, dynamically assigned. So you can put as a static IP or dynamic IP. You can separate that dynamically or statically assigned IP resources into different subnets. And when it comes to static IP address that don't change and are based for the certain situations, such as DNS name resolution, because you don't want to change it once you point your domain name to an IP address. If the IP address changes, your linking breaks. So you want to make sure that it doesn't do that. IP address is based security model that requires apps or services to have a static IP address. So sometimes you're interconnecting some of the IP addresses to the services, you require the static IP to be assigned. Also, when it comes to TLS as SSL certificate linking to an IP address, that's where you consider static IP. Firewall rules that allow or deny traffic by using IP address range, that's where you probably need the static IP to be assigned to those resources. And RBAC, role-based virtual machine, not RBAC, role-based virtual machines such as domain controller and DNS servers, that's where you need the static IP to be assigned. Okay. Now, if you go to the next one, which is it's about public IP addresses. So to create a public IP address, we need to actually create another resource called public IP address. And that needs to be associated with VNet. So we create the IP version, which is typically IPv4. You can also use IPv6 now. SKUs, you want to use standard for the better security. You can set the availability zones. We will learn about the availability zones and everything in the later on other sessions. Then the tier you need to select, whether it's a global or regional. In coming slides, we will learn about what is the difference between global and regional. Then you assign IP address assignment, which is dynamic or static. And routing preference, idle, timeout, and so on. And that's how you create public IP address. So here are the basic things, the main element which you need to keep in mind, IPv4 or IPv6 or both when you're creating a public IP address. Whether you want to go for this basic or standard SKU, typically in a production and organization side, it's recommended to go with the standard. You want to also plan whether it's a dynamically assigned or statically assigned. And you also want to understand about or think about Microsoft or internet routing. Okay. So when it comes to associating public IP address, so these are some of the examples have been given. Now, static IP address is only available with certain SKUs or certain resources. So here is an example. Say, for example, if it is going for virtual machine and network interface card, you have a dynamic option available and static option available. Load balancer, you do the front end configuration for that. Dynamic is also available, static is also available. But when it comes to the VPN gateway, you assign the IP address to a gateway IP configuration. Dynamic is available, but static is only available to certain SKUs. So you need to select the right SKU for it. Application gateway behaves also the similar way, where you assign the front-end configuration, IP address to front-end configuration, and it can be assigned dynamically, is perfectly fine. But when it comes to static, only certain SKUs is allowed. So public IP address resources can be associated with a virtual machine network interface, internet-facing load balancers, VPN gateways, and application gateways. Okay, I hope that makes sense. When it comes to private IP address, again, this table confirms how you can do this assignment. So you can do either dynamic, this is by default. So dynamic assignment is set up by default. Unless you want a static, then you must change that. So in a VM or internet, internal load balancer or application gateway, you go all of the dynamic and static options are available. Okay. So we will just hold fire on the demo, or actually we can actually jump into the demonstration. So in the demonstration, what we'll do, we create a VNet, and we will also continue with some of those other creation. So before we do that, let's go through a couple of slides. So in this module, what we'll learn about the design and IP addressing schema, Azure requirement, Windows Server, and all this stuff. But when we actually do a demo, we will try and touch base on some of them. Some of the area you need to take it as a homework and try and learn about.